Planet Mission Part 1 by David Claiborne, as read by the author. New chapters every Monday. The full novel is available on Amazon.com and other online retailers. Links in the description. Chapter 31. Nothing at all and everything. There was only one thing Bo needed as he boarded the shuttle, a memento from his time with the colonists, the lance Waters himself used hunting his first APOC. How unfortunate that had been, to be forced to kill an innocent animal, though, Bo reflected, seething a little, he had been a willing partner and was therefore guilty. He kept the lance disassembled in 3 parts in a case, which he carried as he boarded the shuttle, already wearing a full flight suit. It was to his advantage that no one would inspect the case. He was a Mufasa missionary, after all. Weapons were illegal on Earth. By extension, regulation forbade them on a mission, and no one would expect him to be carrying one. "Bo, I didn't expect to be bringing you back up until next year," a voice said. "Damn. Captain Jackson, I'm returning to the station early to provide a report. No signal at the colony, you know." Bo had hoped he would not be recognized in his flight suit. "Huh," was all the captain said in reply. He busied himself with the other passengers. The shuttle oriented vertically for launch. Bo climbed to his seat and stowed the case. He fastened the harness and felt his helmet latch magnetically to the headrest. Why a dropship should be called a shuttle simply because it was pointed toward the sky was a trivial matter. Still, as he stared through the cabin at the sky above him, that was the thought that came to mind. Other passengers climbed past him on either side to their seats. At last the countdown began. The boosters pre-fired during the last few seconds. "Ignition," the radio crackled, followed by a deafening roar. Bo heard the radio babble something at Captain Jackson, but it was not discernible above the engines. Bo was pressed back into his seat with a force unlike anything he had ever felt. A bead of sweat trickled under his helmet along his face. It tickled him. He instinctively raised his hand to wipe the droplet away, but could not. The force that pressed his body and limbs against the seat prevented it. It was as if the glove alone weighed 100 kilograms. Even if his hand had not been magnetically linked to his chair, it would have been quite immobile. A trail of fire 100 meters long poured from the shuttle as it rose atop an enormous pillar of smoke that billowed out in a column that stretched into the sky. Like a finger arcing into the sky, it pushed the shuttle ever higher. Water vapor accumulated in a cloud on the shuttle's nose and swirled off with a loud crack as it broke the sound barrier. There was a moment of silence and a loud explosion. "Primary booster jettisoned," the radio cackled. "The boosters will land themselves back on the surface where a team will recover them to use again in a later flight," the captain shouted. "Don't start to unbuckle your straps yet." Always needing to narrate what he's doing, Bo said to himself. Sparks like fireworks trailed away from the shuttle as the boosters separated. He had only a few moments to catch his breath before a second roar rocked the cabin and the force of their travel accelerated him into his seat. This time the shuttle's own engines ignited. A minute later everything went silent. A mechanical thunk signaled the main fuel tank separating from the shuttle. It too fell back to Polus IV. "A team will collect the booster tank as well after it lands. Everything is reused. It saves a lot of money on each launch," Captain Jackson said, this time over the speakers. Their momentum carried them out of the upper atmosphere. The shuttle flipped on its back to intercept with Polus Station, and Bo saw a vast ocean below on Polus IV which they never visited, the colony being on the inland side of the coastal mountains. "It's just a tiny dot after all. Not so important," he said to himself. He tried to see the space elevator, but could not. His head was fixed in place, and it had passed behind his field of view. "If you look out the starboard side, you might catch a glimpse of Polus Station," Captain Jackson said. Bo looked left, then right, and thought he could just make out the reflection of light and shadow on a distant object. It grew larger and larger like a camera lens zooming in as they approached. "We'll dock on the inner fixed spire. That way we don't have to expend fuel to match the station's rotation. There's a fuel shortage, you know. Once you disembark, there's only one way you can go. If you get to the other end of the spire, you've gone too far. Or take some time to enjoy weightlessness. As much time as the station personnel will let you have, anyway. When you're ready, find a pylon marked with your destination helix." Their momentum slowed as they approached the station. It was now impossible to see. They were too close. Gases jetted and hissed and sputtered as Captain Jackson made fine adjustments to align them with the station. Then the shuttle jostled with a metallic thud, and they were still. "You may now unbuckle your restraining harness and depart. If you have magnetic boots, please make sure they're activated. If you do not and you're unfamiliar with 0G, let me know and I'll help guide you to the door. Be sure to collect your luggage before you depart. It'll be a long time before you see it again otherwise. It's been a pleasure serving as your captain." Bo removed his suit and helmet. The shuttle's hatch opened and a staticky metallic breeze swirled around his face as the air pressure inside the station equalized with the shuttle. There was no gravity in the core. It made carrying his case easier since it floated itself, but it also made walking difficult. Molly's magnetic boots helped, left in the rover a year and more ago, but walking in space was still a learned skill. It was one he had not needed since training, and one on which they had spent little time anyway. The long corridor stretched the entire length of the station. It was made completely of metal, as much for structural reasons as to facilitate magnetic maneuvering gear. Windows were rare. Light inside came from high-efficiency LEDs, all the same frequency of bright white. After the intensity of the sun on Polus IV, the station lights were both too bright and too dim at the same time. Bo took note of the interspersed airlocks as he moved up the corridor. He would need one later. Bo found a pylon connecting to the helix he had lived on briefly before taking the dropship to the moon. An elevator sat just inside of the rotating ring. He boarded the elevator and pulled his case inside. A few other worker positions joined him. The doors behind him closed, and lights above the door signaled a countdown that intensified with a beep. When the elevator aligned with the pylon, a set of clamps released. Bo experienced gravity immediately as the elevator carried them to the end of the pylon in a few seconds. He was disoriented momentarily as a door opened in front of him where they had entered the elevator from below. No matter. Gravity was once again where it belonged. He stopped the civil servant position. Her uniform looked like Alice's. "Excuse me." I must be polite to get what I need. "My name is Bo Lee. I'm with the group of missionaries on Polus IV. I need to find a room where I can stay and a secure network I can access to make a report to the director at Mufasa." "Of course," the civil servant replied. The concierges must all receive the same training. This one spoke with similar mannerisms as Alice. The civil servant pulled up his phone and in a few moments had located a suitable room. "Please follow me, Missionary Lee. I would be happy to show you to your room." Once inside, Bo pulled up the network signal. It was full. Finally, a working connection to Earth. He linked his phone, logged into the secure Mufasa VPN. He authenticated the connection with his fingerprint and was glad he had not wasted his Li-Fi allowance. He then made his first call, which was not to Interim Director Shepard. It was a gamble, but she might pick up. She needed to answer for his plan to move forward. "Hello," a voice said. A moment later, the video signal synchronized, and Carrie Black's face materialized before him. This was the person with whom he needed to speak. Waters flinched as they crossed the threshold into the city. His body expected the same resistance he had felt when the missionaries first arrived, but none came. He passed through the gate and was surprised. He expected the first thing that would strike him would be what he saw, but instead he inhaled deeply, and a sweet yet spicy scent struck him, like rose blossoms or sandalwood or blooming oleander or vanilla or fresh-cut nectarines or plumeria flowers. His senses could not discern the aroma. Then he felt the air itself. Crossing the threshold was like passing through golden honey whose sweetness his very skin could taste. Then he both heard and felt the thrumming of bass-filled low frequencies playing below brass instruments of all kinds, bright and cheerful to the ears. Overtones passed right through his chest while a piano and organ accompanied a great choir in the distance that sang the joy of being. Senses overwhelmed, at last he looked around. He saw a space that was vast and open with buildings tall and short inlaid with trimmed and precious metal and gemstones. The stone facades glowed. Indeed, cracks in the pavement beneath their feet barely contained a light that fought to escape. "This is not what it looked like from up on the mountain," Waters said. His pulse quickened, then he breathed deeply. He felt he was about to be overcome by inevitability itself. "You would not have been able to see inside very well for the same reason you could not step foot inside," Molly said. He and Molly toured the city. She was excited to show him the things that had been new to her just a few months earlier. She spoke with vivacity and joy as she showed him vast courtyards and parks and gardens filled with trees and flowers of all kinds. They walked along the river that flowed through the city from its center and out under the wall into the valley. They climbed 7 sets of steps leading to 7 tiers, each level filled with artistry and beauty. There were sculptures, galleries, tapestries, and people making music in the streets or on balconies, or in alleyways around them in secret hidden paths. They heard poets speaking verse and storytellers telling tales. They passed an open stadium where athletes competed as a crowd watched and cheered. There were shops where men and women tinkered. Children raced out of a school to a park across the way. They shouted and screeched with delight at being outside. People ran and played, laughing and talking as they shared and created, as they ate and lived. Late in the afternoon they came to the center of the city on the highest tier, where a large square paved in brick from one end to the other ended in an arched doorway a story tall below a tower that grew 100 yards skyward. Colored glass windows interspaced the tower walls at regular intervals. At the top they saw 2 tiers above a crenulated parapet. The tallest tier had a clock set into a glass wall. A dome with a spire stopped the tower with a rooster weather vane that turned with the wind below a tall cross. Leafy trees strove to match the tower's height throughout the square, with canals full of fish bordered by plants that flowed around the square's boundaries as birds nestled in the foliage. "I'm surprised I can see the top so well," Waters said. Molly just smiled. "That gate leads to the cathedral." She held on to Waters' arm with both hands as they stood in front of the tower in the square. "Are you ready to go in?" "Let's go," he said. The tower itself was massive, which belied the size of the gate through which they walked. 2 Arcuda could have passed through riding piggyback. Looking up from inside, Waters saw from the vestibule that the tower was not hollow but had a high ceiling from which hung a wrought iron chandelier. Hundreds of candles cast their light on the ceiling. "Are those real candles?" Waters asked. "It looks like it," Molly said. "I wouldn't want to be the one who has to clean up the wax," Waters said. "Or change out the candles," Molly said. To their left as they entered the tower was an open door through which they could see a staircase. "I think that leads to the top of the tower," Molly said. "We should climb it sometime." "Let's do it," Waters said, not really serious, but pulling Molly along with him. "Not now," Molly said, dragging him back playfully. "We're going to see the cathedral." Through a second set of arched doors opposite the main doors, they saw the base of a building. "You've seen this before?" Waters asked. Molly nodded. "I don't want to say anything, though. It will spoil it for you." Waters could see the portal at the front of the cathedral through the gate and said to himself, "It doesn't look so impressive from here," not wanting to disappoint Molly. Then they stepped through the inner gate. 2 towers drew his eyes upwards so that even tilting his head back he could hardly see the top. The stones of the cathedral glowed with light like those in the rest of the city, but to Waters' amazement it flowed forth, thick like sap to the rest of the city as it were a stream. Waters found nothing to say. "Just wait until you see inside," Molly said. "Don't get my hopes up, I'll be disappointed," he said, joking a little. "You won't," she assured him. They walked through the doors and down the nave. There were 10,000 things to see inside, paintings and sculptures, flowers, plants, and trees, both arranged and growing live. Carvings of all kinds representing fruiting plants and animals arrayed every surface of the piers and arches inside. Every window was itself a masterwork of stained glass that scattered color. The vault of the ceiling was one vast painted canvas. There was not an inch that did not tell a story. They reached the crossing of the transept, and the space above drew them upward even as they stood on solid ground. It was infinite, as if it were the vault of heaven itself, and held both nothing at all and everything throughout time without end. The sight took their breath away. They stood for a time whose length they could not tell, nor did they want to, and beheld wonders. At last, as if he were pulling himself out of a great river whose tides and currents would carry him forever if he let them, Waters spoke. "Tommy and Junebug can't see this, can they?" Molly sensed immediately where he was going. "No, they can't. Not until they enter the city." "We can't get married here," he said. Molly squeezed his arm and smiled. "No, I guess we can't." They looked on greatness one last time and walked out together. They walked on to where a path ran under a trellis covered with thousands upon thousands of magenta and purple and rose-colored flowers. The flowers hung down so low they almost touched the path. Waters and Molly could not help but brush against them as they passed. In the center the path branched at the source of the flowers, a massive tree with a low trunk as thick as any on Polus, whose branches spread out over the trellis radially in every direction. The path rejoined itself on the other side of the tree. Waters was not really fascinated by plants, but even he had to stop to admire this tree. "You live here?" he asked Molly. "Not here, nearby, just on the other side of the path," she said as she took Waters' hand. They approached a small stone cottage that sat inside a yard surrounded by a low fence. It had a stone path leading up to the door. A gable covered the path where it met the fence, which itself was covered with greenery. Light glowed through a window just to the side of the door and illuminated the grassy yard. The stone walls glowed with a light their own. "This is what I would imagine an old house in Ireland would look like," Waters said. "It is," Molly said. "It's modeled after a cottage near where my grandparents lived back home. It was always one of my favorite places." "It's new then? It looks so old," Waters said. "I guess it is new, though it seems like it's always been there," Molly said. Waters looked at her with wonder. "Is everything like this?" "I think it's all part of Polus, once you can see it." "Good night, Alex," Molly said. She pushed up with her toes and pecked his lips. "Good night, Molly," Waters said, and walked back through the evening light to the shelter he shared with the others outside the city.